This woman lost everything in 48 hours. Her marriage, her friends, her reputation, her entire social world collapsed. Why? Because she publicly humiliated the wrong person. And that person was recording. What you're about to hear is a story about consequences, about a young woman who refused to be invisible, and about what happens when the powerful finally face the truth about who they really are. Welcome to Voice of Granny. While you are here, please hit the subscribe button and comment where you are watching from. Thank you. Let me tell you a story. It's a story about a young woman and about a night that seemed ordinary at first, but turned into something that would change everything. I've been thinking about this story for a long time, and I think it's important that you hear it. Because it's not just about one person. It's about all of us, really. It's about how we treat each other, and what happens when we finally stand up. My name is Maya. The woman in this story, the one whose life changed that night, her name is Zara. And I want to start by telling you about who she really was, because I think that's important. You see, when people look at Zara, they didn't see the real person. They saw what they expected to see. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Zara was 24 years old. She was studying business at one of the best universities in the city, Toronto. She was smart, really smart. She had dreams. Big dreams about making a difference in the world, about understanding how companies work and why they sometimes fail to treat people fairly. She was writing her thesis about discrimination in workplaces, something she cared deeply about. But here's the thing about dreams and university education. They cost money. A lot of money. Zara came from a single-parent home. Her mother, Maria, worked multiple jobs just to keep them afloat. Zara had 2 younger brothers, and when her father left, it was Zara who helped her mother keep everything together. At 16, she was already managing the family's finances, making every dollar count. By 18, she had saved enough money to help put her brothers through college. That's the kind of person Zara was. Strong, responsible, dignified even when life was hard. So when Zara needed extra money to finish her final year at university, she looked for work. She picked up shifts as a waitress at high-end restaurants and catering companies. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid well, and the tips could be generous. She never saw it as beneath her. She saw it as a means to an end. She saw it as taking care of herself and her family. There's no shame in honest work, Zara always said. On the evening of November 15th, Zara put on her black waitress uniform, tied her hair back neatly, and headed to the Grand Duchess Hotel in downtown Toronto. The annual charity gala was happening that night, the most exclusive event of the season. A night where Toronto's richest and most powerful people gathered to talk about charity while showing off their wealth. Zara had worked these events before. She knew how to move through rooms quietly, how to anticipate what people needed, how to be invisible while being helpful. The Grand Duchess Hotel was absolutely stunning that night. Everything glittered. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceilings like frozen teardrops catching the light. Fresh white orchids decorated every table, their perfume mixing with expensive wine and the subtle scent of wealth. A string quartet played in the corner, their music soft and sophisticated. Everything was perfect. Everything was beautiful. Everything was designed to make you feel like you were in a place where only important people belonged. And then there was Elizabeth. Elizabeth Vaughn was the kind of woman who made heads turn, but not for the reasons she thought. She was beautiful in that expensive way. Perfectly highlighted blonde hair, designer dress that probably cost more than Zara's entire tuition, diamonds around her neck that caught every bit of light in the room. But when you looked closer, when you really looked at Elizabeth, you saw something else. You saw cruelty. You saw someone who had been given everything and learned to treat it like it made her superior to everyone else. Elizabeth was married to David Vaughn, a real estate developer who had made millions by buying up property and selling it at huge profits. David was quiet about his success. He wasn't the type to brag. But Elizabeth? Elizabeth wore her husband's success like a crown. She had never worked a day in her life. She had never had to. Her days were filled with spa treatments, shopping, charity lunches where women like her would sit around talking about which charitable causes were fashionable that season. She had the kind of life that most people dream about: unlimited money, social status, beauty, everything. And it had made her bitter. Bitter and cruel. That night, Zara was working one of the VIP sections. She was carrying a tray of champagne flutes, moving between tables with the grace that comes from practice and poise. She had practiced this hundreds of times. Make yourself useful but not noticed. Be helpful but not intrusive. It was an art form, really. Then Elizabeth looked up and saw her. There's a moment when you see cruelty recognize an opportunity. That's what happened in that moment. Elizabeth saw Zara, a young black woman in a uniform, someone she had decided immediately was beneath her. And she saw an opportunity to have some fun, to amuse herself and her friends. Elizabeth deliberately reached out and knocked a champagne flute off Zara's tray. It wasn't an accident. I want you to understand that. It was deliberate. The glass fell, champagne spilled everywhere, and Elizabeth laughed, this high, ugly laugh that turned heads. "Oh, how clumsy," Elizabeth said, her voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I suppose we can't expect everyone to have the coordination to work in refined settings." Zara stood there, looking at the broken glass, the spilled champagne, the people starting to turn and stare. She felt her chest tighten. She felt the weight of embarrassment that wasn't hers to carry. But you know what? She didn't react. She didn't cry. She didn't get angry. Instead, she bent down and started cleaning up the glass with careful, steady hands. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," Zara said, her voice calm and professional. "I'll have this cleaned up right away and bring you a fresh drink." But Elizabeth wasn't done. Oh no, Elizabeth was just getting started. She looked at Zara with this expression of contempt, and she said something that made several people around them stop their conversations to watch. "You know, I really do think the hotel should be more careful about who they hire for events like this. Not everyone understands how to behave in certain refined company." She paused, letting her eyes move slowly up and down Zara's body. Some people just don't have the natural breeding for it. The word breeding hung in the air like something poisonous. I know that word. I've heard it used before. It's the kind of word that people use when they want to say something horrible, but want to pretend they're just being honest or practical. What Elizabeth was really saying was, "You don't belong here because of the color of your skin." But she was saying it in a way that let her pretend it was about something else. Zara felt the stares of dozens of people. Some looked embarrassed. Some looked entertained. Some looked sympathetic, but not sympathetic enough to actually do anything. That's often how it works, isn't it? People see something wrong, but they don't know what to do, so they do nothing. Zara finished cleaning up the glass, stood up, and looked Elizabeth in the eye. And in that moment, something happened that even Zara didn't fully understand. She made a choice. She chose not to let this moment define her. She chose dignity. "Of course, ma'am," Zara said, and her voice was so calm, so centered, that it actually made Elizabeth frown. "I'll be more careful." As Zara walked away to get supplies and a fresh uniform, she didn't see a man watching from the main table. A man with gray hair and a serious expression. His name was David Vaughn, Zara's boss, Elizabeth's husband, and he had seen the entire exchange. He had seen his wife's cruelty. And he had seen something else too. He had seen Zara's strength. David watched the young waitress move through the room, and he made a decision. He wasn't sure yet what it would be, but he knew that he couldn't just let this moment pass without acknowledgement. He knew that something important was happening, and that he was going to have to choose a side. As Zara went into the kitchen to change her uniform and compose herself, she stood for a moment in the quiet space away from the crowd. She let her hands shake a little. Just a little. But not from fear or shame. From controlled anger. The kind of anger that comes from knowing you've done nothing wrong, but been treated like you have. The kind of anger that makes you determined. In that moment, standing alone in the kitchen, Zara made her own decision. She wasn't going to let this night be just another story of unfairness and injustice that she carried around silently. She was going to do something about it. She just didn't know what yet. The night was far from over. And neither was Elizabeth's cruelty. When Zara returned to the main dining area in her fresh uniform, she felt the weight of Elizabeth's eyes on her immediately. Elizabeth had been waiting. She had recruited more of her friends to her little group. Women like Margaret, whose husband owned a pharmaceutical company. Women like Clarissa, whose family had old money and even older prejudices. Elizabeth had spent the time since the first incident working her friends up, telling them about the clumsy waitress, and making them laugh at jokes at Zara's expense. "This is something I need you to understand about cruelty. It doesn't usually happen in isolation. Cruelty is often a social thing. It's often about proving something to your friends. It's often about establishing a hierarchy, about making sure everyone knows who's at the top and who's at the bottom." That's what Elizabeth was doing. She was using Zara to bond with her friends. She was using Zara's pain as entertainment. As Zara worked her section, replacing glasses and checking if people needed anything. She could hear snippets of the conversation from Elizabeth's table. The women were laughing about her. They were making assumptions about her education, her background, her worth. One of them said, "I can't imagine being forced to work like that. Thank God I was born into a family with means." Another one laughed and said something about people needing to understand their place. Zara heard it all. She felt every word. But she kept moving. She kept working. She kept her face neutral and her posture perfect. Then Margaret decided to get involved personally. She caught Zara's arm as she was passing their table, and her voice dripped with condescension. "Dear," Margaret said, as if speaking to a child, "you do understand that workers should remain discreet during events, don't you? You should try not to draw attention to yourself." Zara looked at her, and this time her eyes held something different. Not anger exactly, but a kind of presence that didn't fit what Margaret expected to find in a waitress. Zara was Harvard-educated. She had read hundreds of books. She spoke multiple languages. She understood psychology and economics and human behavior at a level that Margaret would never reach. But Margaret couldn't see any of that. All she could see was the uniform. "Yes, ma'am," Zara replied, maintaining steady eye contact. "I understand perfectly." Something in Zara's tone made Margaret hesitate. There was an articulation, a quiet confidence, that didn't match the stereotype in Margaret's mind. And that hesitation was all Elizabeth needed to see an opportunity to escalate. Elizabeth stood up. She walked over to where Zara was standing, and she looked at her with this cruel smile. "You know what?" Elizabeth said, loud enough for tables around them to hear. "I don't think you do understand. Perhaps we need to have a little test." She picked up the dinner menu from the table. "Why don't you read this for us? Just to make sure you can actually do the job you're being paid for." The room got quieter. People turned to look. Zara understood immediately what was happening. Elizabeth was setting a trap. The menu was in French. Elizabeth thought Zara wouldn't be able to read it. She thought Zara would stumble over the words. She thought Zara would either refuse and give Elizabeth a reason to call security, or fail and confirm everything Elizabeth believed about people like her. It was a moment, a real moment, the kind of moment where you can see a person's entire character revealed in how they choose to respond. Zara took the menu with steady hands. She looked at Elizabeth for a moment, and I want you to understand what was happening in that moment. Zara was making a choice. She was choosing not to be ashamed. She was choosing not to be small. She was choosing to show exactly who she really was. "With pleasure, ma'am," Zara said. And then she began to read. "Soupe à l'oignon gratiné. Homemade thermidor avec sauce beurre blanc. Filet mignon aux truffes noires du Périgord." Her voice was clear, confident. Her French accent was perfect. The accent of someone who had lived in France for 2 years on a merit scholarship, studying at the University of Lyon. The accent of someone who had worked hard, who had earned opportunities, who had educated herself. The women at the table stared at her. The people at nearby tables stared. Even the string quartet seemed to play a little softer, as if they were listening too. Canard à l'orange. Bouillabaisse provençale. Gratin de légumes. Et pour le dessert, soufflé au grand marnier avec crème vanille de Madagascar. Zara finished, returned the menu to Elizabeth with a serene smile, and said, "I hope that was helpful, ma'am." The silence that followed was heavy. It was the kind of silence that happens when something important has just occurred. Elizabeth's face had gone pale. Margaret was staring with her mouth slightly open. The other women exchanged uncomfortable glances. David Vaughn rose from his seat at the main table. He walked slowly toward the group, his expression unreadable. He looked at his wife. He looked at Zara. And then he did something that surprised everyone. "Elizabeth," he said quietly, and his voice had an edge to it that made his wife flinch. "I think it's time we remember why we're here tonight. This is supposed to be about charity, about helping people, not about humiliating them." Elizabeth quickly recovered, the way people like her always do. She forced a smile. "Of course, dear. I was just making sure everyone understood the protocols." But she wasn't done. Not really. She couldn't let this go. Some people, when they're confronted with evidence that they were wrong about someone, they don't learn. They dig deeper. They find new angles. They tell themselves new stories to justify their behavior. Later, after David had gone back to his table, Elizabeth gathered her friends again. And this time, she told them a different story. She said that Zara's French accent was probably fake. She said she must have memorized it. She said, Just because someone can read a menu doesn't mean they actually belong here. Accent tricks don't change what she really is. The cruelty, I need you to understand, wasn't just in the words. Elizabeth said. It was in the energy she created. It was in the way her friends laughed and agreed with her. It was in the way they all decided, together, that they would continue to treat Zara poorly for the rest of the evening. It was the kind of cruelty that is often normalized in certain circles, where wealthy people sit together and tear down people they see as beneath them. But what Elizabeth didn't know was this. Zara had spent the last 4 years systematically documenting cases of discrimination and racism for her university thesis. Zara had learned from her studies that sometimes the best way to fight injustice is to document it, to record it, to create a clear, undeniable record of what happened. Hidden in Zara's uniform pocket was a small digital recording device. And for the last hour, it had been capturing every cruel word that Elizabeth and her friends had said. As Zara moved through the room, carrying plates and refilling glasses, she was watching, observing, learning, and recording. She had learned young, growing up on the south side of Toronto, in a neighborhood where injustice was common, that true strength doesn't shout. It doesn't react. It observes. It documents. And it acts at precisely the right moment. The evening continued. Elizabeth tried several more times to humiliate Zara, but each time, Zara responded with such calm competence that Elizabeth's attempts backfired. Other hotel staff started noticing what was happening. Some of the guests started looking uncomfortable. The energy at Elizabeth's table had shifted from the pleasure of watching someone being put down to something else. Embarrassment, maybe. Or shame. And David kept watching. He couldn't stop watching. Because he was seeing something he didn't expect. He was seeing a young woman of extraordinary character being treated with extraordinary cruelty by a woman he had built a life with. By the end of the evening, when Zara finally clocked out and left the hotel, she felt exhausted but also energized. She had survived the night. More than survived, she had shown exactly who she was. And she was carrying, in her pocket, the evidence that would change everything. The audio was crystal clear. Every cruel word. Every condescending comment. Every moment of intentional humiliation. It was all there. Documented. Real. Undeniable. Zara didn't know it yet, but the night that had started as just another shift to pay her tuition was about to become the foundation of the biggest change in her life. Later that night, after the gala had ended and most of the guests had left, Zara was in the hotel bathroom fixing her appearance before heading home. She had been crying a little, not from sadness, but from the release of tension that comes after you've been under pressure for hours. She was looking at herself in the mirror, really looking at herself, when she heard a knock on the bathroom door. Zara, a man's voice. Are you okay? She recognized the voice immediately. It was David Vaughn, her boss's boss, the man who had watched everything happen that night. Zara opened the door carefully. David stood in the hallway alone, his tie loosened, his jacket unbuttoned. He looked tired, but there was something else in his expression. Something that looked like shame. I want to apologize, David said immediately, not waiting for her to speak. For my wife's behavior. There's no excuse for what happened tonight. None. Zara studied him carefully. She had learned, growing up without privilege, to read people. To understand the difference between empty sympathy and genuine concern. In David's eyes, she saw something she rarely found. Real shame, real anger directed at his own family, real recognition that what happened was wrong. Mr. Vaughn, I appreciate your concern, Zara said. But you don't need to feel responsible for what your wife did. But I do, David replied firmly. I've been married to Elizabeth for 23 years. That's a long time to pretend not to see someone's true nature. A long time to accept behavior that I know is wrong. And I've failed. I've failed to address it, and that makes me complicit. They talked for a few more minutes. David asked Zara about herself, about school, about her background, about why she was working as a waitress when she was clearly intelligent and educated. Zara told him the truth. She told him about her family, about her MBA, about her thesis on discrimination in corporate environments. David's expression shifted. It was like something clicked into place for him. Harvard, he said. My God, Zara. My wife attacked a Harvard MBA student out of pure racial prejudice. Mr. Vaughn, Zara replied, this happens more often than you realize. Your wife simply said out loud what many people think silently. And yes, what she did was wrong. But she's not unique in thinking it. David was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that would change Zara's life. I have a proposal for you, he said. I know it might sound strange, but hear me out. They moved to a quiet corner of the hotel lobby. David ordered 2 coffees, and speaking in a low voice, he told Zara about his company. He told her that his board was pushing for real diversity changes, not just cosmetic ones. He told her that he needed someone with her expertise, someone who understood both the theory and the reality of discrimination, to conduct a complete audit of his company's practices. Mr. Vaughn, Zara said slowly, that's very generous, but… It's not generosity, David interrupted. It's urgent necessity. My company has problems. Real problems. And you clearly have the knowledge and experience to help identify them and fix them. He slid a business card across the table. On it was his private number and a number for consulting fees that made Zara's eyes widen. It was more than she made in a year of waitressing. More than enough to finish her degree without financial stress. Why are you doing this? Zara asked. David took a long drink of his coffee. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with emotion. Because I've spent 23 years married to a woman whose prejudices I silently accepted. Because I built a company that probably replicates the same systemic problems you study. Because I know that real change starts with people willing to do the work. And because tonight, I watched you maintain your dignity in the face of cruelty, and I realized I haven't maintained my own dignity by accepting my wife's behavior. They talked for another 30 minutes. David explained what he wanted, a complete, honest audit of his company's culture, hiring practices, and promotion system. He told Zara she would have complete autonomy. Complete honesty would be required. And real change would need to follow, or there was no point. At that moment, Elizabeth appeared in the lobby. She saw David and Zara sitting together, heads close together, speaking in low voices. And her face changed. You could see the calculation happening. The moment when she realized that maybe this young woman was more than she had assumed. Elizabeth approached the table with a fixed smile. Robert, dear, she said. Wait, I said Robert earlier, didn't I? No, his name is David. Let me make sure you have this right. Her name is Elizabeth. His name is David. I was looking for you. What on earth are you doing here with her? Elizabeth, David said, and his voice was calm but firm. I'm offering Zara a consulting position at the company. She's going to help us with our diversity and inclusion initiatives. The silence that followed was thick. Elizabeth stared at her husband, then at Zara, as if she had just witnessed something incomprehensible. You're joking, Elizabeth laughed, but the sound came out nervous and high-pitched. David, she's a waitress. She's an MBA student at Harvard, David corrected, specializing in exactly the area where our company needs help. Elizabeth's face went pale. The calculation in her eyes shifted. She was trying to figure out how to fix this, how to minimize the damage to her reputation. Well, even if that's true, Elizabeth said, it doesn't mean we should make rash decisions based on guilt or feelings. It's not guilt, David said. It's recognition of competence and real business need. Elizabeth then turned to Zara directly, and her tone changed completely. This is important. This is how some people operate. When they can't dominate you anymore, they try to befriend you. They try to make you feel like the tension was just a misunderstanding. Darling, Elizabeth said, using a term of fake warmth that made Zara's skin crawl. I'm sure you understand that sometimes misunderstandings happen at social events. Perhaps we should all just forget about tonight's little disagreements. Zara looked at Elizabeth, and she didn't look away. She met her eyes directly. Ms. Vaughn, Zara said quietly, there was no misunderstanding. What you said was very clear. What you did was intentional. And I won't forget it. Elizabeth forced another smile, but something in her eyes changed. Something shifted. Because in that moment, Zara had signaled that she wasn't going to be manipulated. That she wasn't going to play the game where victims are expected to forgive their abusers for the sake of social convenience. Well, Elizabeth said, her voice tight, I'm sure intelligent people like you understand that context is important. These situations are rarely as simple as they seem. And then Zara said something that made Elizabeth recoil. Actually, Zara replied calmly, people with my academic background tend to be very precise about context and meaning, especially when things have been carefully documented. The word documented hung in the air. Elizabeth's eyes widened slightly. Documented? David asked, looking at Zara with sudden understanding. Zara didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Her silence said everything. David looked at his wife, and something shifted in him. 23 years of marriage, and he was finally seeing clearly. You were recorded? He asked Elizabeth. Elizabeth didn't answer. She didn't need to. 3 weeks later, Elizabeth, woke up to a sound that would haunt her for months. The sound of her own voice, cruel and disdainful, coming through the speaker of a radio in her bedroom. She had fallen asleep the night before with her phone on her nightstand, and her news app had automatically opened to a headline that made her blood run cold. Toronto elite exposed. Viral audio reveals racial discrimination at charity gala. The 23-minute audio was everywhere. Every major radio station in Toronto was playing it. Every news outlet was covering it. Social media had exploded with clips of Elizabeth's voice, each cruel word accompanied by angry commentary from radio hosts and heartbroken testimony from people who had been at the gala. Elizabeth's phone showed 47 missed calls, more than 300 text messages. Her Instagram followers had dropped from 12,000 to 3,000 overnight. The comments on her latest photos were devastating. Some just said, racist. Some said, shame on you. Some were longer, describing how her words had made people feel, how they represented exactly the kind of prejudice that people were fighting to overcome. She ran downstairs and found David in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and a newspaper. The headline on the front page of the Toronto Star was impossible to ignore. Business leader's wife caught in racial discrimination scandal. David didn't look up from his paper when Elizabeth came in. He just took a sip of his coffee and said very calmly, "That waitress is now our new corporate diversity consultant. Her name is Zara Washington. She started yesterday." Elizabeth felt the ground tilt beneath her feet. "What did you say?" she demanded. "Zara started at our company yesterday," David repeated. "Her first project will be a complete audit of our corporate culture, including an analysis of all employees in leadership positions." Elizabeth's phone rang before she could respond. It was Patricia Whitmore, chair of the board of the exclusive Toronto Tennis Club, where Elizabeth had been a member for 15 years. "Elizabeth," Patricia said without preamble, her voice cold and official. "The board met in emergency session this morning. Your membership has been revoked effective immediately. Your conduct, as documented in the audio recording, is incompatible with our values." The line went dead. Elizabeth stood there, holding her phone, and watched as her entire social world collapsed in real time. The WhatsApp group called Ladies Who Lunch, where Elizabeth's friends posted photos from their shopping trips and spa days, was suddenly filled with messages. Her supposed best friends were distancing themselves. "I can't believe I've been spending time with someone like that. My daughter goes to Harvard. I'm horrified to think how many young people like that girl she might have humiliated without us knowing. James said he doesn't want to do business with Vaughan Development anymore. He doesn't want to be associated with the company." Margaret, who Elizabeth had considered her closest friend, didn't call. She sent a text. A single text. "I can't believe you. I'm ashamed I didn't stand up to you that night. I should have known better." That night, Elizabeth sat in her bedroom, a bedroom that suddenly felt like a prison, and watched her entire social identity disappear. The charities she served on sent formal letters of removal. The decorator she had hired for her summer home sent an email saying he was withdrawing from the project. Even her hairdresser called to say, "I'm fully booked for the next 6 months." By morning, Elizabeth realized something that people like her rarely have to face. She was nobody without the status, without the money and the social position to hide behind. She was just a woman who had revealed herself to be cruel. David moved his things out of their bedroom that night. He didn't yell. He didn't engage in dramatic confrontation. He just calmly told Elizabeth that he had filed for divorce. 23 years, he said, standing in the doorway with a suitcase in his hand. "I lived with this person and pretended not to see. I lived with the small cruelties you inflicted on people, the condescending comments, the casual racism. I told myself it didn't matter, that you didn't really mean it, that it was just how people in our circle talked. But I was wrong. It mattered. And I'm ashamed of myself for accepting it." Elizabeth tried to argue. She tried to say it was all a misunderstanding, that the audio had been taken out of context, that Zara had misrepresented everything. But David just looked at her with sadness in his eyes. "The context is you," he said. "Your words. Your actions. There's no other context that matters." Meanwhile, Zara was at the Vaughan Development office, being introduced to the human resources team in a boardroom that suddenly felt very different from the hotel ballroom where she had been humiliated just weeks before. She was wearing an elegant suit. She was carrying a briefcase full of proposals for structural change. She had gone from humiliated waitress to respected consultant in less than a month. David introduced her to the entire department during a meeting. Starting today, he announced, Zara Washington will be leading our company's diversity and inclusion initiative. She has my complete support and full authority to implement necessary changes in our corporate culture. The employees looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and respect. Many had heard the viral audio. Many understood the significance of her hiring. Zara stood up and addressed the team. And her voice was the same voice that had remained calm under Elizabeth's cruelty. It was the voice of someone who had been tested and had not broken. My goal, she said, is not to punish anyone. It's not to make people feel guilty for past mistakes. My goal is to create an environment where everyone feels valued and respected, regardless of their background, their race, their gender, or their economic status. That's what real diversity means. That's what real inclusion means. The room was quiet. People were listening, really listening, in a way they probably hadn't listened to anything in a long time. Back at her empty mansion, Elizabeth watched her social life crumble through social media notifications. Patricia Whitmore posted a photo from the tennis club, and the caption read, "Celebrating our true values of inclusion and respect." It was clearly a direct rebuke. Margaret posted a photo with other women from their group, a group that no longer included Elizabeth. The caption was, "Real friends support each other through challenges. We are grateful for the people in our lives who show us who they really are." Elizabeth understood the subtext. Elizabeth wasn't one of those real friends anymore. And when she realized that even her hairdresser, had permanently stopped taking her calls, Elizabeth finally understood what she had lost. It wasn't just a marriage or a few friendships. It was her entire identity. The world she had built on the foundation of privilege and power had crumbled because that foundation had never been real. It had always been fragile, built on nothing more substantial than other people's willingness to pretend that her cruelty was acceptable. 6 months later, on a warm spring morning, Zara Washington stood at a podium in front of 300 graduating students at the University of Toronto. She had been asked to speak at the graduation ceremony, not as a student, though she had received her MBA with distinction, but as an inspirational speaker, someone whose story mattered. The auditorium was packed. Students and parents and professors and university administrators, all waiting to hear what this young woman would say. Zara looked out at the sea of faces, and she began to speak. And I want you to understand what was happening in that moment. This young woman, who had been publicly humiliated just months before, was now standing in a position of honor, being celebrated and respected. "Thank you for inviting me to speak today," Zara began. "I want to tell you a story. Not because it's unique, because it's not. Unfortunately, stories like mine happen to people every single day. But I want to tell it because I think there's something important in it. Something about who we are and who we choose to be." She told them about the gala. She didn't name Elizabeth, but she told them exactly what happened. She talked about the humiliation, about the cruelty, about the moment when she chose to respond with dignity rather than anger. "I had a choice that night," Zara said. "I could have let that woman's words define me. I could have let her cruelty make me believe that I was less than I am. But I chose something different. I chose to believe in myself. I chose to trust that my education, my hard work, my character mattered more than her opinion of me." She talked about the recording, about documentation, about the importance of creating evidence of injustice. "I documented what happened that night," she said, "not out of revenge, but out of responsibility. Because if we don't create evidence of discrimination, people can pretend it didn't happen. They can convince themselves that they imagined it. They can make victims question whether what they experienced was real. Documentation is important. Truth is important." Then she talked about what came after, about working with David to implement real changes at his company, about creating policies and systems that actually protected people from discrimination rather than just talking about inclusion. "In the 6 months since that night," Zara said, "the Vaughan Development Company has implemented new hiring practices that have increased diversity at every level. We've created real training programs on racial discrimination and bias. We've implemented reporting systems so that employees can safely report incidents of harassment and discrimination. And we've made it clear that prejudice has no place in our company. That's real change. That's measurable, tangible, meaningful change." She paused and looked directly at the graduating students. "Some of you will experience discrimination. Some of you have already experienced it. Some of you might perpetuate it without even realizing it. And I want to tell you this. The best response to discrimination is not to accept it as inevitable. The best response is to document it, to call it out, and to work toward real change. Don't let people like Elizabeth Vaughn define your worth. Don't let their cruelty make you small. Use your education. Use your voice. Use your position, whatever that position is, to make the world better than you found it. She smiled then, and her smile was radiant with hope and determination. Never let anyone define your worth based on prejudice. The best revenge is success they never imagined possible. The auditorium erupted in applause. Students stood up. Professors were wiping their eyes. Parents were nodding. Because what Zara had spoken to was something universal. It was about resilience, about dignity, about the power of refusing to let circumstances or cruel people determine your future. Meanwhile, in a quiet mansion on the edge of the city, Elizabeth was watching the news coverage of Zara's speech. She had moved out of the home she and David had shared. It had been sold as part of the divorce settlement. She was living in a smaller house, in a less prestigious neighborhood. The money had been divided, but it was nothing like what she was used to. And more importantly, the social position she had lost was something money couldn't buy back. Elizabeth had tried, in the months after the scandal, to rehabilitate her image. She had made statements about how the audio had been taken out of context. She had given interviews where she talked about her side of the story. But each attempt had only made things worse. Each statement she made was analyzed by people who had heard the audio and found her to be, well, exactly who the audio suggested she was. She had tried to apologize publicly. She had posted on social media about how she had learned and grown. But her apologies rang hollow because everyone knew they were self-serving. They knew she wasn't sorry for what she had done. She was sorry she had been caught. The Toronto media had dubbed the situation the Vaughn scandal, and it had become a case study in universities and workplaces across the country. The 23-minute audio was used in diversity training programs. Zara's story was cited in academic papers about racism and discrimination. Elizabeth's words, spoken in a moment of careless cruelty, had become immortalized as an example of exactly the kind of racism that people were fighting against. 3 years later, Zara had become one of the country's most respected consultants on diversity and inclusion. She had worked with dozens of major corporations. She had published papers in academic journals. She had been featured in national magazines as one of Canada's rising leaders in the fight against workplace discrimination. David, after the divorce was finalized, had married a civil rights lawyer named Sharon. Together, they donated half of David's fortune to scholarship programs for underprivileged students. Hundreds of young people, students like Zara had been, were able to go to university because of David's generosity. Zara used some of her consulting fees to help her mother retire. Maria, who had worked 3 jobs for so many years, was finally able to rest. Zara's brothers both became successful professionals. The family that had struggled on the south side of Toronto had built a foundation of stability and success. And Elizabeth? Elizabeth lived a quiet life. She had tried to maintain relationships with her former friends, but they had all moved on. They had all decided that associating with her was too much of a liability. She had tried to rebuild her social circles, but people were wary of her now. She was the woman from the audio, the racist woman from the charity gala. She had attempted to sue Zara, claiming that the recording had been made without her consent and that her privacy had been violated. But her lawyers informed her that the recording had been legal, made in a public place where there was no reasonable expectation of privacy. The suit was dismissed before it even went to trial. Elizabeth had even tried to reach out to David, hoping that they could reconcile, that they could go back to the way things were before that terrible night. But David had written her a letter explaining that he could never go back, that he had spent too many years accepting her cruelty, that he was finally living a life that was aligned with his values. He asked that she not contact him again. Some people, when they experience consequences for their actions, learn and grow. They become better people. But Elizabeth was not that kind of person. Elizabeth was the kind of person who continued to believe that she was the victim, that everyone had conspired against her, that the system was unfair. But here's the thing about reality. Reality doesn't care whether you accept it or not. Elizabeth had said what she said. She had done what she had done, and the consequences were real. 5 years after that night at the charity gala, Zara received a phone call. It was from a journalist at the Toronto Star. The journalist was working on a follow-up story about the scandal, and she wanted to interview Zara about what she had accomplished since that night. Zara agreed, and when the article was published, it told a story of transformation. Of a young woman who had taken humiliation and turned it into purpose. Of a woman who had used her pain as motivation to create real, measurable change in the world. The article was titled From Waitress to Leader: How Zara Washington Turned Discrimination into Advocacy. On the day the article was published, Zara received a text message from an unknown number. When she opened it, her heart sank. It was from Elizabeth. "I'm sorry," the message said. "I've read the article, and I understand now what I did. I ruined my life because of my own cruelty and prejudice. I lost everything: my marriage, my friends, my reputation. And you, the person I tried to humiliate, you used that moment to build something meaningful. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just want you to know that I understand now how wrong I was." Zara read the message several times. She thought about responding. She thought about saying something kind. But in the end, she didn't respond. She didn't need to. She had moved on. She had built a life that was so much bigger than Elizabeth's cruelty. She deleted the message and went back to work. There were other companies that needed her help. There were other systems that needed to be examined and changed. There was more work to be done. On a Tuesday morning in June, exactly 7 years after that night at the charity gala, Zara received an email from the University of Toronto's board of directors. They were offering her a position as a professor. They wanted her to teach a new program on diversity, equity, and inclusion in corporate environments. They wanted her to help train the next generation of leaders. Zara accepted immediately. When she walked into her first classroom as a professor, she saw 30 young faces looking at her with hope and curiosity. She placed her notes on the podium and began to speak. "Welcome," she said. "My name is Zara Washington, and I'm going to teach you about something that matters. I'm going to teach you about the work of creating workplaces where everyone belongs, where everyone is valued, where their dignity is protected. This isn't just academic. This is real work that will matter to real people. This is work that will change lives." And as she spoke, she thought about that night at the charity gala. She thought about Elizabeth's cruelty. She thought about David's recognition of her worth. She thought about the moment when she read that menu in flawless French. She thought about how one moment of humiliation had become the foundation of a life of purpose. Because here's what I want you to understand about this story. It's not really about Elizabeth's downfall, though that's part of it. It's not really about Zara's success, though that's part of it too. It's about something deeper than that. It's about the power of choosing dignity even in moments of humiliation. It's about the power of documentation and truth. It's about the power of using your pain as motivation to create real change. Zara never forgot what happened that night, but she refused to let it define her. She refused to let Elizabeth's cruelty make her small. Instead, she let it make her stronger. She let it clarify her purpose. She let it motivate her to do work that mattered. And that's what I want to leave you with. All of you watching this right now. If you've experienced discrimination, if you've been humiliated, if you've been treated as if you don't belong, I want you to know that your worth is not determined by how other people treat you. Your worth is determined by who you are deep inside, by your character, by your integrity, by your determination to be better than the circumstances you find yourself in. And if you've been like Elizabeth, if you've treated people poorly because of their background or their race or their circumstances, I want you to know that it's not too late to change. It's not too late to look at yourself honestly and decide to be better. But I also want you to know that real change requires more than words. It requires action. It requires understanding the real impact of your behavior on others. It requires genuine remorse and genuine effort to do better. This is Zara's story, but it's also a story about all of us. It's a story about who we choose to be in moments when we're tested. It's a story about the power of dignity and the consequences of cruelty. It's a story about justice, not revenge, but real, measured, meaningful justice. Thank you for listening.